I'm Eddie Watkins, a professor in the biology department at Colgate University. And a big part of my research has really been understanding sort of the comparative ecology of fern gametophytes and sporophytes. And as you would have seen from a previous fern blog where I discussed the life cycle of the ferns, you now should have a pretty good understanding of the differences between gametophytes and sporophytes, where they occur in the life cycle, etc. Historically, fern gametophytes have been largely ignored. They've been thought to be to have few taxonomic characters, be very hard to find, to be very short-lived, to live in areas that are perpetually wet. So what I've been trying to do is sort of debunk some of these myths and create a better understanding of the true ecology of ferns, really by looking at the gametophyte generation that has been overlooked and maligned. So here we are again in the rainforest of Costa Rica, and I have a frond of the fern Diplasium striatastrum. And this fern, as you can see from the back of the leaf, is just loaded with sori. Remember, the sori that are the collections of sporangia that produce those haploid spores. Those spores are cast about by the wind, and they land in suitable substrate and they begin to grow. Well, it turns out that if you just look around you, gametophytes are everywhere. And they're very easy to find. And they do have a lot of taxonomic characters, specialized hairs, unique shapes, etc. As a matter of fact, right here on this stump, I have a number of gametophytes of Diplasium striatastrum. I can tell this because they have special hairs on the gametophyte itself, but also because they have young sporophytes coming out. So I have a whole population here, which I can go use the characters of the gametophyte, relate back to the sporophyte, and I know what I'm looking at. So that provides us now an opportunity to really study the ecology of this stage of the life cycle. And what I've discovered over the last several years is that, contrary to popular belief, fern gametophytes are not short-lived in general. Epiphytic gametophytes can live to be 10, 12, 30 years old, I think. Certainly 5 years, I've had actual evidence of that. Terrestrial gametophytes are a little bit shorter-lived. They tend to, they tend to have a high rate of mortality to produce sporophytes much more quickly than the epiphytic sporophytes. So it's just a quick introduction of how easy it is to really find gametophytes and how you might be able to use them to understand the ecology of the sporophyte generation, the whole plant generation actually. So one other thing that, as you will see from a different fern blog, that I'm really interested in is desiccation tolerance. And that's specifically interesting when we think about comparisons of gametophyte sporophyte generations, because the gametophyte has no cuticle, they have no stomata. They're two very fundamentally different plants, essentially. So whereas the sporophytes, desiccation tolerance in the sporophyte is very rare, what I've found that in the gametophyte generation, it tends to be much more common. So it opens up a whole new can of worms into thinking about the ecology of ferns. So now what I want to do is take you over to the other side over here and look at a different species and talk about the unique gametophyte ecology of Lomeriopsis. Let's walk over here and we'll find some of the species right over here. So here we are at one of the really spectacular fern species at La Selva, and it's spectacular because it's unique in many ways. This is the fern Lomeriopsis vestita. It's one of the very few hemiepiphytic ferns in the world. What is a hemiepiphyte? Well, hemiepiphytes are plants that spend some portion of their life disconnected from the forest floor. They may start on the forest floor and climb up into the canopy and then lose their connections, lose their root connections, or they may start in the canopy and send roots down to the forest floor. What's very interesting about hemiepiphytic ferns is that most of the time what has been called hemiepiphytic ferns really are not hemiepiphytic. They're simply climbing ferns, viney, twiny ferns. We know this is a hemiepiphytic fern because some of the work I've done on the life history of this fern has shown that the gametophytes actually start out as epiphytes. I'll show you some gametophytes in just a minute, but the gametophytes start out as epiphytic ferns, epiphytic gametophytes. Then after fertilization, sporophytes are created, the roots begin to grow down. So for a short time, the young sporophyte is actually an epiphyte, and then the roots touch the forest floor, and then the fern enlarges and grows up the tree, but it never again loses that connection to the forest floor. What's really curious about this is that some of the work we've been doing on desiccation tolerance suggests that the gametophytes are quite tolerant, markedly tolerant actually. The young sporophytes are also desiccation tolerant, but as they change into this adult form, the adult form is not desiccation tolerance. So there's some life stage mediated changes in the ability to tolerate desiccation that occurs along the development of this species. So here we are just a couple of feet away from the sporophyte that we just saw over there of Lomeriopsis vestita, and I found some gametophytes of it. And you can see here, these gametophytes truly are epiphytic. They're growing on this small diameter tree. You see the gametophyte sort of plastered to the surface of the trunk here, a young sporophyte emerging. So here we have the diploid stage of the generation, the haploid stage of the generation, and you notice that the sporophyte looks very different from what we saw before. The sporophytes of this hemiepiphytic fern look very different until they reach the forest floor. We have a young, sort of older sporophyte up here of the same species. It's forked, and eventually what will happen is the plant begins to put all of its energy into root formation. The roots go all the way down to the forest floor, and then the morphology radically changes. So I think that sort of gives you a very quick picture of how you can find gametophytes in the field and how you might be able to think about them in terms of studying them. And contrary to popular belief, they're not rare. I once did a very quick survey here and I walked a straight line transect and I found that I could find gametophytes on 75% of the trees that I encountered. They're very abundant, they're relatively easy to identify to certain genera, and so they're not something to be afraid of. The big challenge, of course, is working in the canopy. I've done a lot of work in the canopy. Finding gametophytes up there is just difficult because it's a hard place to work in general. But there's a whole new sort of black box that's above our heads here where there's all kinds of new hypotheses and ideas to be discovered.